Good morning. This is the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission. This is a special scheduled meeting. We will start with a roll call.
Good morning, Chair. We have Commissioner Ackerman,
Here.
Commissioner Cross,
Present.
Commissioner McGowan, Commissioner Mesner,
Here.
Commissioner Oath, Commissioner Ray,
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Chair, we have 5 of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent. Actually, I think we've got 6 of 7.
Oh,
Because
maybe I missed a vote. I think maybe I was speaking over.
yeah, Commissioner McGowan said here a little tardily because she was looking for her unmute button. So
My
anyway, 6
my
of 7.
apologies, Commissioner McGowan.
No
6
problem.
of 7.
That is a quorum. We're happy to do business today. We have a item on our agenda is called Operations Meeting for Staff to present on the ECMC budget. And I believe we're going to recognize ECMC Finance Manager Matthew Blackman.
Good afternoon, or morning, actually. It feels like an afternoon already after doing some fiscal notes. So I would just like to let you know that I do have a dry sense of humor, so please stay hydrated. I don't want you to, not have enough fluids. One of the things I'm going to do is kind of give some basic background, assuming folks are on the same plane here. And also too, please feel free to have this an interactive conversation. I don't want to just be lecturing to you guys. You guys could obviously feel free to ask any question you want, but I'm going to try to provide just a basic background, some information, and hopefully we could all kind of have a conversation. I'm hoping to present and share my screen. If you don't see my screen, please let me know.
There you go. Perfect.
All right. So basically, like I said, I wanted to provide some information. So one of the things we do is, Einstein discovered that time actually does equal money. So I just wanted to make sure finance has a lame joke in there to start to kind of get everybody some comfort that finance will just be not as dry as you would hope. So basically, what's the state budget process? So our funding requests start in March. They're reviewed by OSBB in July, and they're submitted to the legislature November 1st. So basically, starting next week, we'll be starting the FY 2026 budget request. So legislative briefings and hearings occur typically in November, December for ECMC, and our budget's usually approved by the legislature around March, February, March. Our current budget submission is for FY 25, which ends June 30th, 2025. Like I said, next month we'll be doing the budget submission for June 30, ending June 30, 2026. In this current budget request, it includes a 3% salary survey increase, so 3% salary raise for everybody. Plus, they're going to implement a step system, which is not yet fully developed. So we're still waiting for some additional information on that. And I could get back to you later, hopefully, with that. Right now, also, the governor proposed an ECMC cash fund transfer for this state fiscal year of $15 million, next state fiscal year for $7.5 million, and the following fiscal year for another $7.5 million to the Air Pollution Control Division in CDPHE. So, spending authority, what is it? Spending authority is the maximum amount you can spend, but you must have the revenue because we're cash funded to spend up to that limit. Even if you have more cash, you cannot exceed your spending authority. Basically, there's 3 ways to increase your spending authority: a decision item, which is through the budget process, the fiscal note, which is through legislation, or you get a federal grant. Those are 3 ways to obtain additional spending authority for you. So right now, the legislature's in session between typically from mid-January to early May. Prior to introduction of new legislation, legislative staff ask us to review a bill and to cost it out of we typically get about 2 days or less to respond. Sometimes it's a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit less, depending on when the bill's introduced. This is our chance to get new FT funding. If the proposed language creates an additional significant workload, not just a little bit, but a significant amount of workload. And we typically only get one chance, or otherwise we have to wait two years to get the decision item if we miss something in our fiscal note or in our fiscal impacts. So the fiscal note process is extremely important to us because it's our chance to describe to the legislature why things are taking time, money, or effort from us. Right now, ECMC in the past has had about $96,000 of federal funds. Currently, we're up to about $46.2 million. So in the last 12 months to 18 months, we've received quite a bit of additional money. And this federal funds are direct from the federal government, but they're typically more restrictive than our cash funds. One of the things you're going to see in some of these, anytime you see a federal grant, you'll see something called 2 CFR Part 200. Why is this important for the finance unit? This is what's allowable to spend. So it's in all federal grants, this 2 CFR Part 200. And these are part of the budget and the expenditure side of the grant request. So these are costs incurred specifically for the federal grant. Many of these costs need prior written approval to be allowable, which is why on our initial budget and our grant request, and we try to put everything in that we need. So changes in the budget typically need a prior approval before we can spend out of the federal grant. If we have not done that, we could typically ask for a supplemental, but that takes a couple of months, typically. There are also many items that are unallowable, like state requirements. So if the state requires a permitting, the feds typically will not pay for that element because it's a state requirement, not a federal requirement. Also, typically equipment, unless it's specifically called for in the grant. But sometimes the grant has special considerations that the state wouldn't necessarily allow you to purchase, but the federal grant will. I'm just trying to give you some basic background and history of what we're doing here. How is the budget and expenses? How are they paid for? Well, we have what we call the ECMC cash fund. And that's the levy that we receive money for. We also have penalties and bonds, which we use to cover, say, direct vendor costs for emergencies, plugging, and reclaiming of wells. We also have federal grants that are directly from the federal government, and they're reimbursable. We don't have prepayments, so the federal government doesn't prepay you the full amount. It's on a reimbursable basis. And federal grants are not typically under the state's legislative authority. So if we get a grant in October, we typically don't have to ask the state legislature to do anything. So we just follow the guidelines of the grants. So basically, the Orphan Well Enterprise, I was going to give some background. Currently, our fund balance is approximately $18.4 million. We began spending in 2024. Most of the spending is to plug wells. Very little admin or any other dollars are spent out of that right now, because most of the concentration is spending down the initial IIJA grant, which ends in August of this year. We've already applied for it December of last year, the IIJA formula grant, and we're expecting to get that before August, so we'll have some overlap. The OWP program also received a BLM grant to plug federal orphan wells of $6.7 million, and that's over the span of 5 years. But we're waiting for some additional information on which wells from the BLM. So very little has been spent out of that as well. So once we get the information, we anticipate expenditures to increase dramatically from what we have now. One of the things I wanted to show you is when we talk about the long bill, one reason is the reason they call it the long bill, it's about 700 pages, so it's really long. But what you see in our long bill is what they have program costs, underground injection control, which is a federal grant. So this was the 96,000. What you're not seeing in the long bill is our 46 million yet, because that's for informational purposes and we haven't put it in there. But what you see in our long bill are program costs, Orphan Well Enterprise, some environmental assistance, emergency response, some special environmental protections, and indirect cost assessment. That's what you'll see if you looked in the ECMC long bill. One of the things I did add here was just for this 23-24 fiscal year, all the bills that came in and the dollar amounts we received for these either one-time or ongoing programs. If I'm boring you, let me know. But if you have any questions, also let me know. One of the things you don't see in the long bill, though, in the specific ECMC long bill, are the other appropriations that we have to monitor or that ECMC has to use their cash funds for. And here's a listing of those. I don't know if you could see them very well, but these first part here, the salary survey, the health, life, all the benefits that our ECMC employees and everybody receives here in ECMC that they sign up for and receive. These are appropriated, all of these costs you see here are appropriated in the DNR EDO long bill, but they are allocated from what they call pots, a pot of money that's appropriated EDO, and then EDO already has allocations for each of their divisions. And in that, it's, ECMC is in part of that pot of money. There's other groupings of money that ECMC cash funds are spent down from. For example, DPA has a listing of risk management, workers' compensation. This vehicle lease payments, those are just for the car payments. Any of the fuel or operating comes out of the program costs of the ECMC long bill. But the reason I'm talking about the vehicle lease payments is these are the cars that DPA purchases. We don't have the authority to purchase a car. And so these are car payments that come out of the inspectors and enforcement and all those other folks that drive cars here. Our lease space, the rent at downtown. Our Attorney General's office. Our OIT costs. CDPHE has a transfer from us to fund some of their activities. And then this is the biochar that higher ed has temporarily this year. But the reason I'm mentioning these is just for this year was another $10.6 million out of the ECMC cash fund that you don't necessarily see if you were to look at this part of our long bill. Also, this part of the long bill is $18.5 million. That also includes a little over $6 million out of severance tax. So not all of this right here is ECMC cash funds, but these costs here, AG time, we spent $1.6 million for the Attorney General's office every year. And that's just this year. One of the things too that happens within these categories here are supplementals in mid-year to true it up. So this for 23-24, this year's supplemental is another $215,000 that ECMC cash fund has to pay down. So right now, without even doing much more, it's to almost it's a little over $10.9 million of additional ECMC out of the ECMC cash fund that's being spent for these activities here. And so these are some of the combined activities that are different appropriations that you won't necessarily see in our direct ECMC long bill. So I just wanted to show you, yes, there's additional 10.9 million out of the cash fund that we have to spend. So I just wanted to give you an idea of the scale of the size of things that may not be readily apparent to you if you were just to look at a direct loan bill amount. Does anybody have any questions? I just wanted to give you some general background, leave it open. I definitely want see if you have any questions or comments. I don't want to lecture you. I think you guys have a lot of information and knowledge, but I just also didn't want you to not have enough comfort level just to want to make sure you guys, ask some questions. What do you want to know? How are we doing on our federal funds? Any kind of questions you guys have?
Thank you, Mr. Blackman. A fantastic presentation. It's helpful for the commissioners. It's also helpful for the 49 stakeholders that are also listening in to sort of monitor the work that we do. Looking around to see if commissioners have questions. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the presentation, Mr. Blackman. As a general overview, I did have some specific questions about the budget, and at some point would love. I don't know if it's. I mean, I understand that this is a general overview, but it would be great to have a presentation on some more specificity associated with the budget, particularly around more line items associated with that, so that I have just a better understanding of how the different portions of the long bill are being allocated in different areas, and that's super helpful for me. For example, in your presentation on the line item associated with HB 23-1242, it appears that there was in the ECMC long bill $464,000 that was allocated to ECMC for FTE, but then there's 2 of those FTE are actually DNR FTE and not ECMC FTE, and so just kind of curious how that works into the system, and how that all gets reconciled inside the long bills.
Well, I could respond now if you'd like.
Yeah,
I think one of the things is we have a good relationship with Carly and DNR EDO, and once that was recognized, we just created basically interagency agreement that just said, look, to these FT and these dollars will be set aside within our budget to be utilized by EDO, and during the normal budget process. So it starting July of next year, one of the things we did was just transfer those 2 FTE out of the program costs I showed you in the ECMC long bill up to EDO and the dollar amount, because it was just misallocated during the fiscal note process. So we just kept it, yes, temporarily it'll be here in ECMC with the knowledge of in future years, it'll be in EDO.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. So that's kind of the minutiae or the details that, I've been working with budgets for a long time, at least in local governments and now in state governments, and understand the general processes, but there's different processes at the state that I'm curious about. And so these are helpful things for me. And as far as the penalties associated with NOAVs, those are going into the environmental response fund. Is that correct?
Correct. There's a sub account within the ECMC cash fund that the penalties go into. And in that, they go into the environmental response, the emergency response for those activities, and those get funded first.
Okay. And then how does that determination get made as far as how the funds get utilized out of that environmental response fund? Because in there, I note that in your presentation, there was like an anticipation that some of it would be utilized, I think, for the orphan well program, for plugging of wells. Maybe I misunderstood you. But you know, how do you determine that whether that's being utilized for, you know, emergency situations, environmental remediation, or transferred to the orphan well program?
Because those penalties vary year to year, one of the things we do is we fully fund the long bill amounts first. And so if the environmental response is 325,000, for example, we would fully fund that appropriation, because the penalties vary from year to year. We could have, say, $800,000 in collections in one year and $3 million the next year, because they come in also. Some come in July. Well, that's the next fiscal year. So we could have timing of money. So one of the things we do is we fully fund whatever the appropriation is for that amount first. And then there are projects that our environmental unit has in the pipeline that they then use for the environmental elements of that long bill.
Okay. And then in the long bill, in this process, how does financial assurance tie into this or not tie into this, and how is that accounted for in these calculations?
That's not in the long bill, but it's accounted for in the penalty and bonding. So the bond claims is part of that penalty. And so one of the things we do is we have continuous appropriation for the bonding. So say we claim a bond for financial assurance, we can then set up spending authority specific to that bond claim that we have statutory authority. So say the bond claim is 50,000. We create in core our financial system an appropriation specific for that 50,000, and the state controller gives us authority to spend up to that amount.
Okay.
So that's more external to the long bill. That's just done more through the financial system.
Great. I think those are my questions right now. I appreciate you asking them. You know, still would be interested, and I can, you know, talk offline with you just because I'm trying to get smarter on this, but some of the more specificity on a lot of the line items associated with capital outlays and you know, individual department expenses and those type of things that you know, I'm just interested in how decisions are made around that. So
Well, we have several hundred object codes,
right,
which gets down to that specificity, but I didn't want to put the whole audience to sleep going through those. But yeah, we have as much detail as you ever want, so feel free to ask. It's, you know, open, so you let us know and I'll present wherever you want.
Great, thank you.
Others with questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Blackman. I was curious if I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about what we're funding at CDPHE, who's an important partner for us. My understanding is the current transfer, the 1 point whatever million, supports the liaison that we use for consultation processes, but that can't be $1 million. So I'm wondering what else we are currently transferring to CDPHE and how that's being used. And then what that $15 million transfer, and then I think it's 7.5 afterwards, what that will be used for. And does it have to be linked to oil and gas activities? Because it's been collected by us from an oil and gas purpose?
Okay, let me take the second question first. The $15 million is a transfer out of our cash fund, and it's to the APCD cash fund that they use. It's the stationary sources. They call it stationary sources cash fund. That's the cash fund they use to operate their programs. So they had some additional needs for their cash fund that the governor has requested in this budget that we transfer out. So with the $15 million transfer and the other additional transfers will be used by them to operate their programs. So the additional transfers are for programs directly related to the oil and gas, the 1.1 million. And so it's their activities that are directly related to oil and gas that they normally have operated. That's been in the long bill for several years. But the transfer is more of a one-time transfer of these additional larger amounts to shore up their cash funds until they can raise their fees.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right. Thank you, Mr. Blackman. You might want to hang around. I think we're going to hear from Ms. Jacobs now.
Thank you very much. Let me get my screen shared here. Hopefully that works. I think we're
Looks
good.
great.
All right. Always nice when that works works on the first time. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Carly Jacobs. I'm DNR's budget director. And Mimi Larson kindly invited me to your meeting today to give a brief overview of severance tax, which is an important part of your budget, as Mr. Blackman discussed. But it's a little bit smaller. So it's about $6 million of the total that he shared with you. So I've been working with severance tax and losing a good deal of sleep over it for about a decade. And I've taken to using this cover slide because I feel like it's emblematic of how severance tax goes. It's, you know, kind of stormy, but there's always hope on the horizon. So that's how I like to kick things off. Let me get started. So I'll be brief today. I understand that everyone doesn't live, sleep, eat, and breathe severance tax like I have, but Commissioner Messner, be careful what you wish for. I'm happy to talk about the details anytime, but I just wanted to start out with what is severance tax and where does it come from? Colorado collects severance tax on non-renewable minerals as they're severed from the earth, severance tax. And the revenue is intended to be a compensation for the depletion of natural resources, right? So reimbursement from the extraction of natural resources in the state. It's levied on oil and gas, coal, molybdenum, which I'm always glad when I get that word out correctly, metals and oil shale, pursuant to statute. Severance tax is also the most volatile and difficult to forecast revenue stream in the entire state. And the reason for this is both where it comes from, so market conditions, commodity market conditions, and the actual structure of the tax itself. So approximately 97% of severance tax revenue is generated by oil and gas activity. And so when we talk about severance tax, we're really largely talking about oil and gas, the impact of oil and gas. And as you can see, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with what prices of production look like and the volatility that's inherent in those factors. And so that in and of itself drives a certain level of volatility in the revenue that we collect based on oil and gas activity. But there's also structural elements of the tax itself that enhance that volatility. And specifically, I'm talking about the ad valorem tax credit. So severance taxpayers can take a credit equal to what is currently 75%, formerly 87%, of their prior year property taxes against their current year state severance tax liability. So essentially, you know, they'll produce oil and gas in year one. The ad valorem property tax is assessed on year one production in year two. And then in year three, you pay your property tax and therefore sort of earn and apply that credit against your state liability. So this has the effect of amplifying sort of the inherent market volatility in the revenue stream itself, in part because of that lag, that 1, 2, 3 year lag between when the credit is earned and when the credit is applied. So if you have very high oil prices in year one, you're paying a lot of property tax, you're producing a lot, you're paying a lot of property tax, and you're earning a really big credit in that first year. That credit doesn't get applied until year 3. And we all know it can happen to prices month to month, but year to year. If you've earned a big credit on $100 oil and you apply it in year 3 and oil happens to be $50, you're applying a really big credit against your severance tax liability to a fairly small state tax liability in that third year. Other way around, if oil is $50, you're earning a very small credit. If oil is $100 3 years out or 2 years out, you're applying a very small earned credit to a very big tax liability. So it really just amplifies the swings that we already see in the revenue stream based on market volatility. So this little graph here is a little bit dated, but I think it's a good way to sort of show the amplification. So that dark blue line is net severance tax, but you can see that bounces around a whole lot more than gross severance tax and the value of the credit. Just as a note, we also have a stripper well exemption. So wells that are low producing wells are exempt from severance tax and also excluded from the calculation of the credit. So brass tacks, how much does severance tax generate for the state? And top line, sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's not a lot, and sometimes it's nothing or less than nothing. So average statewide severance tax revenue on an annual basis is approximately 160 million when we look over the past 10 or 20 years. But as you may expect, the average is a really bad thing to rely on because of that volatility. So here is total annual statewide severance tax revenue from fiscal year 10 through projections for fiscal year 26. I've run that red line right through the middle. That is that $160 million average. And as you can see, severance tax is almost never 160 million square. It's either way above or way below, in part due to that volatility. So what do we do when we get it? How is severance tax distributed? And this is how it starts to find its way into your budget. There is a statutory distribution formula. So statute dictates how earned severance tax is distributed across state purposes. So the first thing is a sort of an off-the-top use of severance tax for the Decarbonization Tax Credit Administration Fund. That's the product of recent legislation, 23-1272. If you remember on that slide when I was talking about the ad valorem credit, it used to be 87.5%. For those of you who have been around for a while, that 87.5% number is likely familiar. 1272 made that change to the ad valorem credit and sort of directed the excess, the difference in revenue that resulted to this Decarbonization Tax Credit Administration Fund. So that's the first stop for revenue. So once that extra is kind of skimmed off to the side there, statewide severance tax revenue is divided half and half between DOLA and DNR. So the Department of Local Affairs gets half, which goes to their grants and direct distributions to counties. And the Department of Natural Resources gets half, which goes to the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the Severance Tax Operational Fund. So those are the two programs in the orange box there. So 50% to DNR, which is then split in half again, half and half to Perpetual Base Fund and the Operational Fund. So what do we use that money for? Really important things, as it turns out. I'll start just really quickly with the Severance Tax Perpetual Base Fund. This is a really important fund for water projects funding in the state. It's a large revolving fund administered by the CWCB, and it's used for water projects loans and also to support 3 water-related grants programs. The CWCB administers this fund as part of their broader portfolio of cash funds in support of water projects funding in the state. So it's really critical on the water side for all of those important programs and initiatives that DNR is responsible for. But where it matters most for you is on the Severance Tax Operational Fund side. So you can see there that ECMC is that sort of slate blue wedge in the wheel there with $6.1 million. ECMC is what we consider a core program, and core programs essentially are annual appropriations for ongoing operations within DNR and the Colorado Geological Survey. So those appropriations are for core base operations and functions. We have 155 approximately FTE, full-time permanent ongoing FTE, that are supported by these appropriations. You can see that you are joined by CWCB, Parks and Wildlife, DRMS, and the Avalanche Information Center within DNR, all of whom have annual appropriations from the operational fund. I believe that your 6.1 million is part of the program cost appropriation that Matthew showed you. So that's where it gets spent within your budget, but that's where that's appropriated. So 19.8 million in total core program obligations across all of those divisions. And then we have another 14.5 million stacked on top of that for these 21-281 programs, including the Species Conservation Trust Fund, the Aquatic Nuisance Species Program. We have a little bit going to the Department of Ag for their soil conservation grants. And then the most recent addition is the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, which gets $5 million from the operational fund annually. So in total, we have 34.3 million in annual appropriations or obligations from the fund. So money that we authorize to be spent every single year. And those obligations are about 34.3 million in total, which is inclusive of that 6.1 million that goes into the ECMC budget. And there's also why I called them reserve protected programs is because there is a 200% statutory reserve requirement. So statute requires or directs DNR to maintain a reserve within the operational fund that's equal to 2 times the current year appropriations or obligations. So in this case, we're right at 68.5 million. So we have our first pot, which is the pot that we're sort of spending, the dollars that are going out the door. And then we have our reserve that's equal to 2 times the authorized amount. So 68.5 million. This reserve was put in place to protect these programs from the volatility of severance tax. So as you may imagine, and part of what has robbed me of a good amount of sleep is managing the responsibility and obligations of permanent programs and staff in light of this revenue pinging around, you know, an average of 70 or 80% change just year over year. And so this reserve was intended to set money aside so that if and when revenues decline, we have a reserve available to kind of help us stabilize that funding for you and for the other programs. So in total, we have $100 million of total obligations between the programs and the reserve on an annual basis. The great news about the reserve is that it is currently full. So with the last 2 boom years of severance tax revenue, we completely filled that reserve requirement. So we currently have 2 full years of funding, right? 2 times current obligations. We have 2 times the available funding to help sustain programs over time. That is really unusual. And it took 2 really big severance tax years to completely fill that reserve. So it's a great thing. And it's something that we want to protect as best we can because it's not guaranteed to last. Just to put this in some perspective, right? You remember those 35 million of program obligations? In order to avoid spending out of the reserve, right, and sort of spending down that safety net, we need $35 million of new revenue each year to support the dollars that need to go out the door and keep the reserve untouched. But if we get less than $35 million in a particular year, that will require that we tap into the reserve. So with an average of 160 million, right, $40 million, half of half, go into the operational fund. So we're pretty close to that $35 million mark, but we know that that average is not reliable. And there will be years that are significantly below that. And just as a great illustration of how volatile severance tax is, we went from a year with negative $15 million in statewide revenue to 300 million to the positive. So that's an unusual swing even for severance tax, but like that gives you the gist of how far things can change depending on price, production, the size of the credit, and other factors like that. So, you know, keeping a close eye on that reserve, but I'm really pleased that we have it. I think it is certainly part of the effort to help stabilize funding for severance tax supported programs, at least operationally. But we will certainly keep a close eye on it. And I'm always happy to chat about severance tax anytime. So happy to come back and keep you apprised of what's coming in the future. But that's my brief overview. I hope that was brief enough. But I'm happy to take any questions about severance tax, how it fits into the ECMC budget, whatever you'd like to know.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. Really appreciate the presentation.
You bet.
Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Jacobs, for the presentation. I've heard different versions of this a few times, but I still think it's a great presentation and super informative, and I learn a little more each time. And then inevitably I have a bunch more questions every time I hear it. And so so appreciate you being here. My first question is around the ad valorem, and first question is why that 3-year lag? Like what was the catalyst for creating that 3-year lag for that?
The 3-year lag is just a necessity. So we can't know what your credit, like you need to produce to earn your credit. So that's the first year. And then you need to pay, you get your assessment the next year because the year finishes, you do your taxes, it's assessed, and we can't apply it in the same year that it's assessed. So then it's applied the following year. So it's really just a structural element. I will say that there have been some legislative changes that attempt to compress that time lag. So I believe it's in tax year 26, they're changing the formula so that it's, I believe it's multiplying a percentage times the previous year's mill levy as a way to sort of like approximate that on a shorter time scale, which should help move that credit closer to when it's earned. But for the history of severance tax since, you know, until that change is implemented, it's a lag. It's just a structural necessity.
Well, that makes sense. And then how does that work with the structure? And I can probably answer my own question here, but you know, should a well be transferred or operations be transferred? How does that transition work for the ad valorem?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure one that I have the exact answer to for you right this second, but let me give that a think and I'll get back to you if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then the stripper well exemptions, you know, I think I've asked questions about this before, so I understand the history of it and the whys, but now I can't remember, those exemptions don't apply to the severance or to the taxes associated with local governments, right? That exemption is a state exemption only. Is that right? Or am I making that up?
I believe that's correct, but it's important to know that they're exempt from severance tax, but they also don't count in the credit. So they're just sort of like totally removed from a state perspective. Yeah.
Got it. And then I was kind of curious because I hadn't been following, but what is the, I think it was 23-1272. What are the uses for that decarbonization fund?
That is a very large piece of legislation, lots of tax credits and also administrative costs for the Department of Revenue to implement. So it's just associated with funding the cost of that legislation. And I'm happy to send you a brief on that so you can see all the details. There's just a number of programs that are involved.
Yeah, I'm happy to look it up.
Yeah.
I just was kind of curious what the goal there was. And so those are the questions I have. Thank you.
Well, Commissioner Messer, I will be sure to change up my roller coaster graphic for you so that next time the presentation is
I think
fresh.
it's still
Fresh and new.
I like it. I
Well,
like
thank you. I
um,
appreciate your question.
no.
Further questions? All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Jacobs. Really appreciate your presentation to us this morning.
Of course, anytime. Thank you for having me.
Commissioners, that concludes our business for today. We've got a business agenda tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll see everybody then. With that, I would move to adjourn. Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? See you tomorrow morning. Thanks, guys.